Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jonathan Tice, and I will be moderating today's discussion about small and medium-sized businesses and the world of payments, which, as we shall discover, is an extraordinarily overlooked and underappreciated but critical part of the economy. Joining me today, we have Kamran Hedjri, the founder and CEO of PXP, and we have Gary Palmer, the founder and CEO of Payall. So the genesis of this debate is a white paper that was published very recently that I was lucky enough to author, looking at the small and medium-sized business world and the fact that actually it generates very nearly half of the world's economic value add, but is probably the most underserved segment of the global payments world. Not only that, but the industry probably spends most of its time looking at the big ticket picture, looking at the big ticket payments, and completely ignores the very painful day-to-day experience of the small and medium-sized business where in terms of inclusion, in terms of empowerment of women, in terms of growth of the emerging economies, this is the area that the industry needs to be looking at. So without further ado, the way we're going to frame this, we will start with the G20. They very helpfully gave us a guide in their roadmap to what the payments world should look like of the 4 topics that we need to discuss. 1 is cost, 2 is speed, or lack of, 3 is access, and 4 is transparency. And within this debate, we're particularly going to focus on the UK because for a couple of very idiosyncratic reasons, the UK, Brexit, and also something that happened to the bank's ring fencing, which has made it much more difficult, is probably at the epicenter of the way you should be thinking about and exploring what, as a payments provider or stakeholder, you should be trying to provide for the SME business. There are more than 5.5 million SMEs in the UK. Globally, it's more than 97% of all businesses. As I mentioned, ring fencing and Brexit have made what was already a difficult subject that much more difficult. Things like account closures are a massive issue. So, without further ado, we will introduce Kamran to talk about, Kamran, when you look at your industry and you look at the UK and you look at the struggles of the SMEs, and I give you cost, speed, transparency, where should we start? Because clearly it's very easy to point the finger, but actually implementing change for something so important is not easy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can start with the topic of access for SMEs. And you mentioned something about account closures and the way the whole landscape has changed and how difficult and how much burden they have to go and source out a banking facility and find out the right approach. And it's getting more restricted and more difficult for the SMEs to access it. There is the Basel 3.1 that came and then made it more difficult for the SMEs to access these facilities. And obviously something like ring fencing was introduced in UK, ring fences of the funds, that also made it more difficult. And also the whole topic around Brexit came on top of this and made it also difficult for the SMEs to interact and with the European Union and those markets. So that's one topic, the access point, and this is one of the struggles they have, and obviously, managing those when you have even the bank accounts, right? Managing the funds in a way that you can do it in a cost-efficient way, and then you have interaction with the different parties and having those things that managing that cost and making sure that this payment cost, which is a very important part of the life, right? And as the cash flow is a very important part for the SMEs, is also a very, very crucial aspect. And it is not.
Yeah, I mean, it would be fair to say that cash flow is actually more so, having covered the financial sector for 30 years, for SMEs, cash flow is the lifeblood.
Absolutely.
And it strikes me, having written the paper, and we'll move on to Gary for a minute here, The lack of transparency and some of the pricing. I know that banks are renowned. I've been a banks analyst for 30 years for their ability to make money. But the lack of transparency from the side of the customer is kind of unique in this space as well. Not only do you not really know how much you're being charged until you find out, you actually don't know where the money is half the time. Can you sort of speak to that and what can be done about that?
Well, Jonathan, thanks for having me. And let me take a step back and sort of frame out why these issues exist, because we can't really address how we fix them unless we understand why they exist. The fact is that for the last 50 years, financial institutions have worked together in a construct called correspondent banking, where essentially one financial institution in one country partners with a financial institution in their country that has global reach, or they find financial institutions around the world that they can partner with to make cross-border payments. And these partnerships allow for the financial institutions to pass each other data. So for example, if I own a bank in Brazil, or I'm a customer of a bank in Brazil, and I want to make a payment to the United States, in order for that to happen, the bank in Brazil has either found a correspondent bank in the United States to enable them to make a payment to the United States, or they've found a bank in Brazil or someone else, some other correspondent bank that has that banking facility in the U.S. The problem with all of that is very simple. There's never been software built at the correspondent bank or at the originating bank that allows for them to automate their risk and compliance rules, and that drives the issues around slow transaction volume and costly, because this is handled by human beings. The lack of transparency is that there's no system to share the data. So that's the root cause of these issues. There's never been software built to on the old-fashioned correspondent banking system to deal with these issues.
Sure. I mean, here's a question. I'll flip to Kamran for this one, because what surprised me, but actually made a lot of sense as I was writing the paper, was that a lot of these SMEs end up turning to consumer solutions. Fair enough, it's a bit more expensive, but as you say, the software hasn't been built to connect these legacy banks and bricks and mortar and all of the legacy problems. But there is software out there that most of what they want to do, they can do. But for some reason, the SME seems to fall in between the consumer and between sort of the corporate world. And maybe Kamran, you could just speak to that for a second. When you the point of the paper was, actually, as an SME, you have such a horrible time that you end up going and using something that is consumer designed. But surely that means the technology is kind of there for small transactions.
It is to some extent, right? But it's not actually widely spread, right? If you want to have, we are becoming more and more a global world, right? And then for some parts, there is a solution there, and that you need to do. But as you expand and geographically, you need to interact across multiple geographical position. Then the compliance topic that Gary was referring to comes into place. The whole setup will get more and more complex, right? And then soon you hit, right? Maybe you can solve it for one corridor, but then if you add more corridors and you want to more interact, and that's how you grow as an SME, you need to basically offer that globally. You hit that threshold. And then
well, I was going to say there are two things. You're absolutely right in that some of the SMEs have turned to almost like remittance type companies. Now, the fact is that for smaller value payments, small value B2P payments, or some small value B2B, they can deliver some capabilities through remittance companies because they've been trying to build their own infrastructure to wrap around financial institutions. But there's a better way that's been coming along, that's been developed, and this is companies like MasterCard, where MasterCard, and this is not the card side of MasterCard, but inside that card business are three assets that MasterCard has that's enabled them to fix some of these problems. And so now companies like Kamran and others can turn to MasterCard cross-border services and what we do, and where there's been new software built, new paradigms built that overcome the speed, the efficiency, and the transparency issues. And I think that these new models, these new paradigms are just now being introduced. And I think it's going to become very, very significant over the coming years as more banks, building societies, e-money institutions, payment institutions are aware of this. So there is hope coming and help coming for SMEs. It's a little bit slower than everybody would like.
I mean, just as Basel and many, many regulatory changes have brought unintended consequences, I suppose one of the issues that I looked at in the paper as well is it's not just about opening these channels. It's actually, if you're an SME, it's all about time. It's all about, great, so suddenly you've created some software and I can pay 35 different clients. But what about my accounting software? What about... So I suppose the point of software should be that it solves all of my problems. How useful is software currently for SMEs that, great, I can now pay, but oh my God, what do I do with this and what do I do with this and how do I embed it into my... Can you just talk through how people work together who are building this software to try and make my life as an SME easier?
So basically, that's a important point, right? For the SMEs, there is multiple facade of their problems. First of all, they need to get the payment in some way or form, right? They're selling it as the goods and services to multiple markets. So they need to have the right set of payment options, payment facilities, and identify that. That's one part of the problem, right? Then they need to get some kind of a banking facility and payout facility so that they can actually interact with the suppliers, with the employees, with all the payments that they have. And then you're addressing a very important part, right? They need to reconcile all these things and have an access to an ERP system. So that's one important part, that aspect, integrating that, in and out and the ERP system, and then put on top the embedded finances like lending facilities and all those things.
Can you do that now? Okay. Is that possible at the moment?
We are on the way to that, right? So that's our roadmap. And as Gary was saying, that the schemes, right, and MasterCard in specific that we're discussing has solved one part. We were working predominantly on the front part of it, where we integrated 120 different payment options to offer in multiple jurisdictions.
Sorry, can I just stop you there? 120 different...
Alternative payment options.
Just talk us through that, because again, that sounds amazing, but that's like a lot.
one part of the equation, right? It's actually offering the specific payment options in the specific jurisdictions like US, North America, Latin America, Europe, UK.
And what sort of payment options are we talking?
You're talking
Cash
about the wallets,
and...
the digital wallets, and then different voucher payment options, mobile payments, specific type of options that are specific. Like, I give you examples. PIX in Brazil, right? That's huge, right? So there are all different options, open banking solutions across the multiple jurisdictions. Connecting all those things is one part of the whole journey. But then at the end, you need to also be able to offer and help the merchants to do the payouts and interactions. And then hence we partnered up with Payall and MasterCard in that perspective, so to help the merchants with that aspect of the business.
So Gary, I mean, if your software helps sew all these bits together, I suppose we had a massive outage very recently that grounded aeroplanes, and we suddenly realised, CrowdStrike, etc., that it's one thing having this connectivity, but the flip side is if it doesn't work, it can get quite ugly. So can you just talk through how on earth do you go about connecting all of these channels and all this 150 different payment options, etc.? How does it actually sort of work?
You're making an interesting point, or leading to a point, which is people are always debating the concept of interoperability versus interconnectedness. And as Kamran alluded to, and as you referenced, we've seen innovations around PIX in Brazil, and we've seen the mass adoption of real-time through SEPA, and now FedNow in the U.S. I think it's impractical to think about global interoperability, and it's one of the challenges we see with compliance executives and central banks and lawyers, where everyone talks about building interoperable systems, but you can't even get countries or regions to agree on the definition of what is KYC. So how do you figure out what data you pass or don't pass? So the point here is that let's move beyond interoperability and let's think about interconnectedness. And this is where companies, not just mine, but other companies that specialize in building connections to these endpoints, whether it's a payment endpoint to allow a payment to be made, or it's a payment endpoint that allows a consumer to make a payment or a business to make a payment into a system, or for a system to make a payment out of an entity to make a payment out of a system. So these technology companies are evolving and connecting and building this. Now, the key here for me, in my view, is we believe these types of services should be available through companies like Kamran and banks and building societies, through regulated financial entities where there's safety and protection, consumer protection.
Consumer protection is key.
We're
exactly.
not a
It's
fan
everything.
of these maverick businesses, and they're not all fintech. It's people operating in an unregulated way. But I get the need or the desire by some, or the opportunity that some see in doing that, because they feel like the industry itself is moving so slow. But now, again, I mentioned MasterCard cross-border. Visa has a similar service. We see domestic networks around the world, domestic payment networks wanting to connect and create interconnectedness. Jonathan, we're on the cusp of major innovations in cross-border payments that will help SMEs. But the fact is it's going to be messy. It's going to be imperfect. And we're not going to be able to address sort of the leading part of your question, which is, how do you solve issues around like the CrowdStrike disaster? Unfortunately, we are all interconnected, and there is interdependency for some components in software. And we are going to find ourselves confronting those types of issues, as well as bigger issues with nation-state attacks and other activities. And we need to be thinking about not just the coolest, fastest, most efficient way to make a payment, but making them safe and redundant and durable. Yeah. And all of these become elements that have to be baked into this process.
No, absolutely. I have to say that was a refreshingly honest and straightforward answer. I mean, these things are not straightforward. But I think if we get into the nitty-gritty slightly, then clearly I'm a UK citizen. We have a big change of government. We have famously called a nation of shopkeepers. And if ever we needed to sort of start playing with Europe again, it's now, for many, many reasons. So can we get a couple of examples going on, either by industry or think about if I am a travel company in the UK or Cameron, I mean, I don't know, you pick the industry you want to give me an example of, but talk me through kind of how horrible it is at the moment to try and do business across Europe, but how change is coming and how it will help.
Yeah, I think let's pick business like business that sells cross-border e-commerce transactions, right? So basically that they need that, right, for the business, right? So obviously you would need, in order to offer your products, the local payment options across the multiple, countries or geographies that you do. You cannot just go and say, okay, I've got these payment options and this is the international one, because people in different countries have got different preferences, right? So what it means that you need to actually interact and build up, relationship with those payment providers and get a contract and all those things. That's the first barrier, right? And then regulation has changed, right? And there is different set of rules on the custom and what have you. So there is a lot of those topics coming up: taxation, custom, duties and what have you, right?
And you guys help with that.
We have got understanding of those sectors and those requirements, and then it can be a consultative approach, right? And also the whole market access is changing, right? So that's basically another topic. Before it was part of the European Union, and it's not, right? There is a certain rules and restrictions coming up, and it gets more and more, right? And for us to identify what are relevant and how we can actually interact, and how we can provide a service in that direction, it's important. And obviously cost is important, and operationally, automating the system and Gary discussed that it's a very important part, ring fencing, making sure that the money is safe and you're under certain regulatory frameworks, and you need to make sure that that consumer protection happens and merchants are safe in that, merchant funds are safe. That's also a big part of that thing that we give you the trust.
Before Gary jumps in, I do have a question about kind of the cost, because having been a financial analyst for a very long time, I met the guy who set up Wise several times. His mission is he stood up in a meeting, and he shouldn't have said it, but he did. He said, I want to drive the cost of transactions to zero, which clearly is not ideal. But when we think about cost, I mean, for FX, that seems to be the dirtiest little secret. I mean, the way people don't understand, and volatility's come back. We've seen in the last few weeks the yen carry trade unwind and all of the ramifications for emerging market currencies. Can you just talk through, both of you, maybe Gary first, but clearly transparency is a big thing. The FX part of it is a massive thing. The liquidity I don't think is. So can you just talk through what you aim to offer an SME customer so that at least they understand what to expect?
Well, I think you nailed the problem in the beginning, which is the goal of what we try to enable financial institutions and regulated entities like Kamran do. And it, just to put it bluntly, is that we are determined to enable SMEs to make safe, fast, low cost, and transparent cross-border payments. Full stop. That's our mission. That's our focus. It is a as you have correctly identified, it is foundational to the global economy. It has been a pain point for far too long for SMEs. And I don't want to get into, all back and revisit all the reasons why, but the outcome has to be, we've got the paper for that. That's right.
People can read the paper.
We want to make a world where an SME is not struggling from week to week or month to month because of the friction and the costs and the issues surrounding making a cross-border payment or getting paid themselves. And the headline is that companies like Kamran, technologies out there from the likes of MasterCard and others, do represent game changers. And so the timing of the white paper, elevating that, making folks aware of these issues and these alternatives, it's a well-timed subject for sure.
And Kamran, before you step in, I mean, we also had the Institute of Exports. I mean, they've been given a 2-year mission to look at this and understand from a UK perspective what needs to be done. And I genuinely, having never been a Labour voter in my life as a UK citizen, I look at it and think, you know what, I do actually think they'll repair some of the damage, and I do think things would improve. But if you had a wish list and you were allowed to go in and talk to the sort of Department of Trade, the leaders, and say, these are the 3 things that you absolutely have to get right, and here's the order. What are the 3 areas that you want them, specifically say UK to Europe, forget the rest of the world, UK to Europe, where do they need to start?
Take the starting point, the access to these kind of facilities. That's the starting point, right? And this needs to be much more harmonized and understood. And
what do they need to do then?
Yes, I think nice understanding the risk of the businesses and then understanding and supporting them, because a lot of those SMEs are coming to the market and they need that support in order to be able to access the facility, the banking facilities.
Who's going to pay that and understand that though? So are you appealing now to the bank system? Because the regulators, etc., well, we know how stretched they are, the FCA, that kind of thing. It's a nice idea, but I've been working with the FCA for 30 years, and there's a lot of weakness there as well as a lot of good intent.
Of course, yeah. No, I think I understand the regulatory aspect and the reasons and rationales behind that restriction of access and regulatory accesses. But to your to the point we were making earlier, right? There is a development to actually add additional facilities next to the bankings, right? So that they can actually access those things in a very harmonized way and then use them and utilize them. And then
so we need some common sense and a little bit of relaxation of some of the unnecessary stuff in Basel 3.1, for example.
That's definitely. I mean, PSD2 was helpful for helping the whole speed of the payment and all those things, but it's restricted to one area, right? And it's not globally, right?
So would you want the UK, given that it's trying to cozy up to Europe, Do you think that they should continue to try and be an independent regulatory, sort of using common sense and a bit more market freedom to enable this area to grow? Or do you want them to tie themselves to Europe and Basel?
I think they need to understand the good things about the regulatory things that are coming out, right? And taking the advantage of it. That's the common sense, to your point early on, right? That's the way to go. And obviously, making sure that it's adaptable and applicable to the regulatory environments that we have in UK. But there are good things coming out in the PSD3, and then there are relevant parts that can be adapted, right?
Jonathan, let me dive in and answer the question. I'm going to come at it from a little different angle. I'm going to focus on two things. The first is, and I realize, and having lived all over the world and work all over the world today, that what I'm about to say doesn't really sound very nice to most UK citizens. There's a tendency in the UK, perhaps more than most other countries, to really demonize banks. And I feel sad for the financial institutions in the UK. Listen, let's not also be ignorant of some very important realities. And the three realities I want to share is, if you're a bank anywhere in the world, but in the UK as well, particularly, you're faced every single day with three issues that consume the majority of your IT budget and innovation budget. And that is protecting your data from hackers. And we as consumers, we want our data protected. It takes time, money, and effort to be able to protect that data from hackers. The second is maintaining existing software that banks have. There are some banks that have as many as 10,000 different systems. Imagine the software upgrades and the patches and everything that has to go into maintaining those. And the third is the ever overwhelming reality of changing regulations and modifying your systems to always stay up for new regulations, whether it's regarding a credit card or a savings account or a car loan. So if you're a bank, there's this massive sucking sound of money and resources to take care of those three things, and you don't really have a lot of capital left for innovation. One of my recommendations, not just for the FCA, but central banks globally, is create incentives that allow financial institutions to invest in technology to modernize their system. That's the first big idea. The second thing, and I feel strongly about this, and again, this is we see this being adopted in certain countries around the world, but it's absolutely relevant for the UK and it's absolutely relevant for the US. And that is central banks, as they're regulating financial institutions. For whatever reason, they've chosen to say to e-money institutions and payment institutions, if you need to safeguard funds, you need to protect user money, but you can't do it with us. You got to go find a commercial bank to hold your accounts. Honestly, Jonathan, being pragmatic, that's a massive mistake. The central banks themselves and the regulators, if you're going to regulate a payment institution and an e-money institution, provision deposit-taking services for them. Enable them direct access to the domestic payment networks. If the central banks and the regulators around the world were to do these two things, it would enable new entrants to come into the market, new innovations to be deployed, and consumer funds would still be protected. Now, in order to do that, those central banks and regulators themselves need new software. But the point is if you want to really make an impact and elevate or create an environment that stimulates innovation, you got to provide an incentive to invest in technology. You got to provision deposit-taking services through central banks for companies like Kamran, so he doesn't have to go to a commercial bank to have someone hold his funds. And you need to enable financial institutions like Kamran and others to access domestic payment systems. If you do those things and it's done smartly and safely, we're going to see amazing innovations for SMEs. But until that happens, what's happening today is elevating and improving the option for SMEs.
Just one thing, so Jonathan, just add something right there, because it just jumped in my head as you were discussing this and the central banks. So the other topic that is coming up more and more, and it's getting more and more relevant, is the CBDCs across the multiple jurisdictions, right? And you got digital euro and the whole different types where the central banks are playing a bigger role into this thing, and it's going somewhat in that direction. But until this is really, widely spread and distributed, and then the roles of the commercial banks are clear, there will be a time passed, right? So and this is part of that whole journey that we're going through.
We've actually got a chapter that I called "Putting CBDs to Bed Early," and a shout out to Oliver Wyman and a shout out to Citigroup, because certainly it's a long way down the line, and it's a kind of quite an expensive experiment at the moment, and it's more of a protection mechanism for now. But I think what you're both saying, and Gary, particularly to you, I'm a long-time banks analyst, and the one thing that's very interesting is, actually, you're right, banks are demonised, and here's a great example. So the reason that they can't change their spots this quickly is because how much money they make in payments. But here is a perfect example. HSBC launched Zing. And the reason they've launched Zing is because it does all the things it should do as a payments thing. It attracts millennials. They charge a lot less. The last thing they wanted to do was cannibalize this enormous profitable business they've got. But they see the future. They understand the future. They launched Zing. So I think everything you're saying is absolutely fair. The banks have you cannot dislodge the system, and if anything, ring fencing is slowly being unwound. So a lot of these problems will slowly work. I'm conscious of time, so Kamran, you get to talk to one set of stakeholders and ask for one thing, whether it's the regulators, whether it's fintechs, whether it is the banking community. Who do you want to say what to?
It's a difficult question. I want to talk to many of them and say many different things, right? But I have to pick one, right?
Just one and one set
right?
of stakeholders.
Now, I think what I would like to do is we established at the beginning the SMEs are underserved, but they are hugely impacting our economy and are responsible for a huge part of the labor employment within the economies, right? In all over the world, right? And this is where actually the economy and the people are actually earning their livings, and they need support in that direction to access and get a better service out of it. I would definitely.
Who are you asking that from?
I'm asking this from the regulators. That's where we need to start and then understand that how we can actually ease and not touching the regulatory compliance and AML and all those things.
More common sense, less red tape.
Exactly, and understanding how we can actually provide more support from our perspective as regulated financial entities and part of that ecosystem to provide a better service for those SMEs. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll make sure it gets there. So, Gary, your one set of stakeholders and your one request.
I serve financial institutions, originating institutions and correspondent banks and other regulated entities. My message is simple. Don't allow familiarity bias or the way things have always been done to prevent you from considering other possibilities. There are new paradigms, there are new technologies, there are new ways to support SMEs. And don't allow this, well, I've never done that before, no one's ever done that. Don't allow that to create a fog around what's necessary and right for SMEs. Consider new possibilities.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
we heard you, Gary.
Hopefully,
we are partners.
Hopefully that will have been of use to people listening, because the thing that I learned writing this paper that I did not know was how big the SME community was. How terrible financial institutions, since I've been an analyst for 30 years, I understand all of this, and I know regulation, and I know the reasons. But the importance of that to the economy and actually people, but also ESG and all these things people pay lip service to, and empowering women. Actually, this is the way to do it. So hopefully you guys who have listened, and ladies, would like to download the paper. I'm reliably assured that there will be a link, however you've seen this, that you can download the UK Spotlight or the paper, and also you will be able to get in touch with either Kamran or Gary. But thank you both very much. Very interesting topic, and I have no doubt we will be revisiting this.
Thanks, Cameron.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you, Gary.